we'll be covering part 2 of the study, as I said, where the carcass is, which covers, in this study, where it actually covers chapter 68 of the book. And we covered the first part last Sabbath, and we will cover part 2 this Sabbath. I do want to reiterate that kind of approaching this as an open study. So as we go through it, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise those questions up, because you know, the more I think we can glean from this, the better. In part 1, we covered this concept of these sticks of memory for the house of Joseph and the house of Judah. And as we've studied throughout biblical history, Judah and Joseph have been the protectors of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so when you talk about these 2 legs of the image in Daniel, you're talking about these 2 houses of Israel. And then you have the other 10 tribes, so that are the 10 toes. And we see them mixed with miry clay and iron. And this iron, according to the author, is an amalgamation of Rome with Israel, right? And we see Israel corrupted through Roman influence in religion, etc., throughout the years and to this day. The great whore and her daughters have captivated the religious audience of the tribes of Israel throughout history. You know, Wes was just reading about Rehoboam, and we're going to be talking about Jeroboam very soon. And we know what happened there with the corruption of the calendar and moving away from the correct keeping of the Feast of Tabernacles. And as a result, Israel, the northern 10 tribes, were carried off into distant lands and never seen again. Well, we're going to see that these people are called out and they're brought back. And we talked about it a little bit in part 1, which in my opinion was quite fascinating. But anyway, so let's dive into chapter 31 in the book of Jeremiah. We see that the house of Judah, we can see what happens to the house of Judah in secular history in these last days. So if you look at verse 11 of Jeremiah, well, at some point, Jeremiah 31, verse 11 says, "For Yehovah has ransomed Jacob and has redeemed him from hands too strong for him." So through Judah, we have the blood of Jesus, the Christ, through the house of Judah, that actually redeems Jacob. And it's interesting, it's kind of ironic that through Judah, Jacob is redeemed, but Judah will have nothing to do with the Messiah, which, you know, is kind of interesting, but that's how it is. It says, has ransomed Jacob from the hand, and redeemed him from hands that too strong for him. Or, in other words, released him from bondage and captivity to buy them off and deliver. So they were redeemed, right? paid for. And apart from their long history of punishment, this captivity of strength we saw enacted out by when Hitler held the Jews prisoner under the regime of terror, right? So God was dealing with the house of Judah through this Holocaust that occurred in the Second World War, which Daniel 11:36 already told us about under the name of indignation. And indeed, Judah paid his price in blood for his sins. And finishing under Hitler, whose Nazi hands were too strong for Judah to break loose. And Judah was scheduled to be annihilated by the Germans, and they couldn't have broken free unless until the days of blood, or until the payment was sufficient to wipe out the sins and clean the slate of the debts. Right? So God was punishing Judah through Hitler, and that was their Holocaust. And there is a Holocaust for Joseph coming. So, and that was done so that God could bring the Jews back to the Holy Land, and Judah could stand upon his feet as a man and fight again. So he was delivered from the Germans, and that old lion Jacob, of whom Judah took responsibility. So the house of Jacob, as it were, not Israel, but Jacob, Judah has responsibility for. And this lion no longer crouches in the dust of the earth as prophecy ordained. And you can see that in Genesis 49:9, where it was prophesied that Judah would be a lion crouching in the dust. And so these are the two mountains of Israel's people, Ephraim heading Israel and Judah heading Jacob. Right? And as I said, so you have these two pillars, these two legs of that are the two feet of 10 toes and of iron and clay. So if we look at Ezekiel 36, in Ezekiel 36, verses 1 and 2, which is a message to the mountains of Israel, it says, also, and you, son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel, and say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yahovah, because the enemy said of you, Aha, and the ancient heights have become our possession. So verses 1 and 2 in Ezekiel 36, they speak words of duality to the land of Israel and its desolate mountains, and to the desolate mountains of the people of Israel. And then we continue on in verse 3. It says, therefore, prophesy. Whoops, what happened? Therefore, prophesy and say, thus says Adonai Yehovah, precisely because they made you desolate and crushed you from all sides, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations, and you became the talk and evil gossip of the people. And then continuing on in verse 4, it says, Therefore, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of Adonai Yehovah. Thus says Adonai Yehovah to the mountains and the hills, the ravines and the valleys, the desolate wastes and the deserted cities, which have become a prey and derision to the rest of the nations all around. Right? And so verse 3 of Ezekiel 36 speaks of the mountains of Israel being swallowed up and made desolate, having been lost in secular history. Right? They were swallowed up. They didn't exist anymore in secular history. And according to this author, that is depicted in the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14. So one might ask, who are these that say they were a chosen race? For they have now become eaten up or peeled into other nations, right? And that's what this is talking about. And are servants and foreigners in other strange lands. They are nothing without honor, without their real name, without a land to call their own, right? So when these 10 nations were carried off into captivity, this was their state, right? They lost their name. They had no land to call their own. And through the centuries of history, the two mountains of Israel's people out of Samaria and Judea have become victims, seized in the spoils of war, made prey, if you will, and those that make mischief for them have laughed them to scorn and derision, just like the scriptures tell us. So these prophetic words out of Ezekiel, spoken centuries ago, even today are acted out on a global stage. The mountain of Israel's peoples are also to be found in the USA and in the British Isles and the Commonwealth countries. These gossipers that we just read about hold them in derision, in jealousy, and many are despised. And they themselves are losing reputation for lack of knowledge and understanding within biblical prophecy. These nations don't even understand who they are. The USA and the Commonwealth. And some of us have been turned away from that table of the Lord, as it were, as teaching a strange thing, right? These false religious systems. And that's the commingling of Rome with the clay of Israel. The situations of many people in the search for knowledge and truth haven't changed with the passing of the centuries. It's the same thing. Years ago, ignorance of our Father's law once destroyed others of mankind who knew better. They were tortured, burned at the stake, or they were ostracized. Today, the punishment is cynicism with unbelief, a form of taking one to the cleaners, as it were. And Ezekiel 36:6 again speaks of the land of Israel. We'll read 36:5 through 7. It says, "Therefore, thus says Adonai Yehovah, surely I have spoken in my hot jealousy against the rest of the nations and against all Edom, who gave my land to themselves as a possession with wholehearted joy and utter contempt, that they might make its pasture lands a prey. Therefore prophesy concerning the land of Israel, and say to the mountains and hills, to the ravines and valleys, thus says Adonai Yehovah, behold, I have spoken in my jealous wrath, because you have suffered the reproach of nations. Therefore, thus says Adonai Yehovah, I swear that the nations that are all around you shall themselves suffer reproach." And then continuing on in verse 8, it says, "After many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war." Now this is is in reference to Gog. He says, after many days you will be mustered, Gog, of the land of Magog. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. So this house of Israel and house of Judah are about to receive their memory sticks, as it were, making them remember all things from out of their secular and spiritual histories. Right? People are going to begin to understand from whence they came. The valleys, rivers, cities, and wilderness are all conditions or appearances to which the people have been called or have lived. And the remainder of Ezekiel 36 spells out the whole nation of Israel's future restoration and conversion into a holy flock. And that's coming. So let's go back to the verse in which the expression mountains of Israel came from in the prophecy we are unraveling. That in Ezekiel 38:8. Where he says, after many days you will be mustered. In the latter years you will go against the land that is restored from war, the land whose people were gathered from many peoples upon the mountains of Israel, which had been a continual waste. Its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. Now, we've already understood the words that after many years, the earth will be visited by superior beings in the end time of years. And these superior beings, according to the author, are the angelic hosts sent by God to stir up God. And it's funny how that, God does that stuff. He stirs up people against Israel. He hardened Pharaoh's heart so he wouldn't let Israel go. He leverages or uses these people to punish Israel time and again. Oftentimes, when I read the case of Pharaoh, it appears as almost against his will, right? He didn't want it, but God hardened his heart. So he uses it, these people to punish Israel time and again. And according to the author, Russia is going to go into the continent of America, in which reside some of the people of Israel and Judah under Manasseh's banner. Right? We are under the banner of Manasseh. And this American wilderness was taken by some of the children of Israel for their own purposes. And many times with and through the killing sword, right? Delivered, it says, restored from war. And that waste place became known as the New World. So this land that was waste, meaning it was empty, became the New World. And this phrase, which had been continual waste, is interesting. And it says, and its people, whoops. It says, its people were brought out from the peoples and now dwell securely, all of them. Because we're dealing mainly with the life of the people of the nations of Israel, who are under an unbroken covenant. Other nations around the Israelites are known as heathen, a word meaning a barbarous people of those who worship other gods, or of the Gentiles of those nations who affected Israel's social structure throughout history. And these lands, their lands are called waste or wilderness. And this is the wilderness picture we're dealing with in America through the prophet Ezekiel in verse 8 of chapter 38. And these words, which had been a continual waste. Now, a waste is something that's vast or empty, as I said, and can resemble a desert, a wasteland, for instance. And it's usually a wild place in which wild animals or wild men live. And it's also a tract of land that is uncultivated, usually uninhabited by human beings. And if there are humans in these lands, then they tend to not put down roots. They're nomadic in nature, like the animals. They're migratory. Now, the American continent was such a vast waste place as this, and in the same category. And if you look at American history, it will help fill out this biblical description. And we'll take a brief look at some history. The Americas, as we know, is a term designating two separate parts of North and South of one continent, of which North America includes the United States and Canada. Now, the United States is the focus in Ezekiel because of biblical prophecy and through Manasseh's blessing in Genesis 48. Though this continent was called the New World after the much lauded explorer Christopher Columbus was deemed its explorer in 1492. They say he discovered America. Well, there were people already here, so he didn't discover it. But nevertheless, even in spite of the fact that they gave him credit for discovering it, or deemed to be its explorer, it was named after Amerigo Vespucci, who was an Italian explorer. And later explorers gradually making known to the Old World the immense landmass men were dealing with. Right, this is a huge area. So North America was not Asia or the Indies, as at first thought, but a continent whose geography comprised of plains, prairies, Great Lakes, rivers, forests, and mountain ranges, etc., with tribes of people dotted here and there of Mongol or Slavonic physical appearance. And today, those folks, known as American Indians, have intermarried considerably with the Europeans that settled here, and to a lesser extent some of the other races. And the destruction of the Indian races, the Native Americans here in this quote-unquote wilderness, was foreseen in prophecy and in Scripture. It's like what happened in the land of Canaan. God told Israel when they went into the land of Canaan, you destroy every man, woman, and child. Now, this wasn't quite to that extent, but, the Europeans were not kind to the American Indian, that's for sure. And now, we're mixed. I have, Native American blood in me, and many of you do too. So it's not a complete destruction, but certainly took over their way of life and did some pretty heinous things to them in the process. And the reason was so that Israel's children would live and multiply as the sands of the sea, as it was prophesied, or an exceedingly great army, which you can see in Hosea 1:10 and Ezekiel 37:10, in a land to call their own, and would dwell safely, as Ezekiel explains. And it's quite interesting because We saw in Egypt, Israel was protected under Pharaoh, and they were able to grow in that time to millions of people until, that Pharaoh went out and Joseph died and they became enslaved. So God used Egypt to shelter Israel, not unlike he did with England. He used the sea and the isolation from Europe to protect the UK, and the same with the United States or the Americas, right? So Israel came over here and they were allowed to grow into a great and powerful nation because of their isolation. The prophet Isaiah explains why the early people of the white Europeans in America were given the land. He says in verse 4 of Isaiah 43, he says, "Because you are precious in my eyes and honored, and I love you, I give men in return for you, peoples in exchange for your life." So we've been schooled in the past in American history, telling us of those God-fearing people from European lands seeking freedom to worship God in their own way and away from mind-bending rituals. Their flag and constitution forged in compassion for mankind. Their motto proudly boasts, "In God we trust." These early American people whom God loved were so different than today's American society, it's really unrecognizable. They had principles which are, these days especially, a rare commodity. And while they may not have had the entire truth, Israel is still loved by God and was brought here to protect them. And they had much stronger principles than what they do today. So when Isaiah speaks of men and people given for their lives under Manasseh's banner, they were mainly the nations of the Indians who fell before the white European flood of people. We saw that in our history. The great nations and peoples of the Blackfoot, the Kiowa, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, the 10 Dakota tribes, the Omaha, the Pawnee, the Iroquoian family of 6 nations, the Algonquin, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminole, Navajo, Natchez, Shoshonean, the Karok and the Yurok, etc. All of these. These many peoples lived scattered from north to south in the American country. And these great proud nations of Indians fell before the children of Israel because those children had to fulfill prophecy spoken by the prophets of old, and they had to consolidate their own families into a nation, and nations taking them into the end time of all men's ruling power. How else could man say in the last days that the people in America and America or the British Isles are the children of Manasseh or Ephraim, etc., as Ezekiel and other prophets tell us? Secular history has been slowly fulfilling all of the sayings, vows, and promises out of biblical prophecy over the years, exactly as we read it in the blueprint. So some Bible students look on these prophecies in past scenario or futuristic prophecies subject to Judah dwelling safely decades ahead of us. At the same time, they say that our future is running headlong into mass destruction brought on by atomic war. Can we do both of these things at one time? it doesn't seem very likely that you can have this, Judah dwelling in safety and heading into mass destruction at the same time. America was once called the land of the free, where safety and security reigned, and where no foreign invasion ever entered. That's been a boast in the United States. We've had no foreign invaders. The English coming in from Canada, notwithstanding, and ransacking the White House. But it won't always be that way. For according to this author, Russia and its many friends will enter America, as verse 9 of Ezekiel 38 and Daniel tell us. If you turn over to Ezekiel 38, verse 9, it says, "You will advance," talking about Gog, "coming on like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your hordes and many peoples with you." So when Ezekiel says the word "you," he's talking about Gog, or Russia, in the land of Magog. From verse 3. "Who shall ascend which, they're interesting words. The people who are represented by this Russian dictator will go up into the air. Now, this is the writer's interpretation of this, right? In the act of climbing into scan, they're moving upwards over America. His attack upon North America is a conventional one at first, so it's not initially a nuclear holocaust. I mean, if you think about it from a realistic standpoint, it really makes no sense for the world to nuke the United States. They don't want to make this place unlivable. They want to take it over and rob it of its resources. That's what they want. So we have to ask ourselves if it really makes sense to initiate a nuclear holocaust and destroy the very thing that you're after. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe eventually it'll come to that. I don't know, but I guess we'll find out. So they're gonna move upwards over America, and the attack upon North America is going to be conventional at first, which is exactly what we have already read about in Daniel 11:44. Russia goes into North America, notably by air, covering that land as dense storm clouds. And this is a statement which could only be fulfilled in the last days because air attacks were never heard of in Ezekiel's day. In verse 9, we have a vast array of planes, rockets, with perhaps paratroopers that will be seen coming in over the land, heavy and black. The Air Force swirling and darkening the sky with great building storm clouds. And those storm clouds are going to burst forth over the ground in a deluge of bombs and men. And Russia will bring with him many nations of people. All will be ready to overrun America. And they gladly want to place the United States under the heel of that socialist dictatorship. And it seems like they won't even have to fire a shot to do so the way things are shaping up, because we are seemingly running headlong into communism, willingly. So now we need to move on to Ezekiel 38, 10 through 12, and understand the second part of the prophecy, which is a word picture of the second foot of ruling power seen in Nebuchadnezzar's image. That is the ex-British Empire, which is the memory stick of Ephraim. So if you turn over to verse 10, it says, "Thus says Adonai Yehovah, on that day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme." So when Russia is entering and covering America with these storm clouds of invasion, in the same fashion that he hit Germany with in a whirlwind of his forces during World War II, and you can reference Daniel 11:40. So Gog now thinks to open another war front. This thought that he's hatching in his mind concerns Britain. The thoughts that we read about in verse 10, it means that this is a separate entity to what he is performing at that same time, right? So he's doing one thing, and then in his mind, he's scheming on some other things that he wants to do. And these second thoughts are a set of circumstances and events which will lead him to think this evil thought. When an evil takes place, it's not good for anyone, and it has bad qualities of a natural or moral kind, and it's going to be hurtful, it's going to be wicked and destructive with great calamity. And this thought in Russia's mind is towards something framed in a mental state of silent contemplation for a terrible purpose. Now, where and upon whom does this evil thought rest in this world? The answer is supplied in the next verses of Ezekiel 38:11 through 12. So, Ezekiel 38:11 says, and say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. This is now a description of another land other than North America, and is spoken towards some more peoples of the mountains of Israel. So we'll unravel the first line, the land of unwalled villages. Russia now declares his thoughts to others with the words, and you shall say. The evil thought of verse 10 now becomes a plan of action, right? So first he's got this evil thought, and now he's actually doing it. And Russia is in a state of climbing or ascending on high upon America. He's also changing toward another land. He doesn't travel south to the land of Israel in the Middle East as yet, but up to another land in his own vicinity. The land of unwalled villages is his mischievous target. And remember, we're dealing only with the children of Israel, these mountains of Israel, and their land, and where they dwell safely. Now, the mind should instantly think of the land called the British Isles, where Joseph's strength of arms and hands through God have kept these people alive, nurtured and unconquered over the centuries. From Genesis 49:26, the Isles is the only place in Europe throughout the centuries that have dwelt safely without the need of walls for protection to keep her people safe. its wall against its enemies from Europe have always been the English Channel, whose tempestuous seas held back many invaders, even Napoleon and Hitler. These British Isles have had people fighting time and time again within its own shores, as each prince of Israel from William the Conqueror took its own place in prophecy on the throne of England, thus causing those internal wars. Or as Daniel says, that Roman 10-kingdom isles became a divided kingdom of Roman iron and Israelite clay throughout its centuries. So these walled villages were a usual mode of protection against marauding nations, seen in Europe and elsewhere in the world. Even the modern Maginot Line, which France built as protection against Germany, was a wall of defense, where people lived inside and carried on their day-to-day business. Before the car and planes became the dominant force in the lands of the world, Britain especially was a land of villages, nestling quietly through each historical era, with some counties hardly altering their sleepy existence. And there was a saying in the 1950s that said some of the sleepy parts of Wales didn't know the Romans had even left. And such, that was how unchanged things were in the state of Wales. And secular history indicates that Roman British culture, or Anglo-Saxon civilization, or Norman governance of the British Isles had little interruption in some of the farming settlements and villages when these momentous changes came into being. And yet these eras of invasion were also the times of great upheaval for this land. And I think there's a lesson for us there in history that, living in these cities piled on top of each other, that's where the forces of control are going to concentrate. Right? They may come out and harass the people in the hills once in a while, but by and large, they're not going to mess around too much with, scattered few here and there. So in my opinion, and it is my opinion, that we're better off left, outside of these big cities and stay more rural in nature. So Ezekiel 38:11 continues. He says, I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. Now, as we have already seen, the Isles were and are today a land where there are no defense walls, bars, gates to keep the people in and the enemy out. And the means of keeping people inside walls today usually means a prison or a mental institution. Or as we have seen in our day, East and West Berlin was divided by a wall, shutting people off from each other. Now, of course, there are remnants of walls in Britain, such as Hadrian's Wall, across the northern borders of England and Scotland, which the Romans built to keep the Picts and the Scots confined to their land. The Romans, as we know from history, were masters at building walls during their occupation of the Isles, which today many ruins here and there bear testimony to. Roman London, which was the largest city, was surrounded by walls 20 feet high and 3 feet thick and 3 miles in circumference, with gates named Newgate, Aldergate, Bishopsgate, etc. So a Roman British town was completely excavated at Caleva, or Silchester, Hampshire, in modern times, with a turreted wall all around, with north, south, east, and west gates. Legionary fortresses were established at York, Chester, Caerleon, and Richborough, with walls and gates. But when the Israelite clay of the tribes finally molded itself into a united kingdom, walls, bars, and gates were structures of the past, and Shakespeare was able to write his lyrical words on the Isles in the 16th century. Let's see, what did he write? He wrote, "This royal throne," right? Let me back up for a second. So the Russian he of Daniel, or Gog of Ezekiel, goes into the British Isles who are at rest. And Ezekiel, or Daniel 11:45, explains how easy it is for him to plant his tabernacles in that land through subversion and infiltration. Daniel 11:45 says, "And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end with none to help him." So, gone now are the days when the seas were the protective wall or the protective moat. Around the isles, forbidding men to enter, because in this prophecy, Russia has gathered to himself various nations and lands, one way or the other, into a large jumping off complex. Right? So as rockets, planes, and ships can now enter the isles at will. And that's, you know, the purpose of all of these foreign military bases that these superpowers have, including the United States. They're jump-off points to easily be able to attack another country. Now, there are no sea gates in other nations. In other nations' lands, as in the days of old, which the isles once controlled to stop the enemy's approach. See, it was prophesied for Israel to be able to control the gates of their enemies. And so there are no ways to bar the approach with sea mines, barrage balloons, nets, guns, tank traps, or miles of early warning equipment. The high and low flying missiles and planes are not susceptible to that. And today, an index finger pressed on a far distant button or trigger can devastate a nation without a man in sight. A quote-unquote bar, which is spoken of in Ezekiel 38:11, is a line drawn across a dividing space over which one cannot cross. It's to prevent, hinder, and obstruct people. And it's a bolt on the door, or can be an obstruction at the mouth of a river or harbor, etc. These gates spoken of are a type of door which opens or closes to a passage at sea or a dam or dock, etc., which prohibits unwelcome visitors. It's to be remembered that the British Isles, in the days of her imperial greatness, once controlled the sea lanes of the world by strategically placed naval bases or sea gates here and there, namely Gibraltar, Malta, Alexandria, Cape Town, Suez, Singapore, etc. Excuse me. Yet these gates were on other nations' lands and not around the immediate isles itself. Kept them far away. It seems these days that the Russian naval fleet has in its program a bid for world domination of those sea lanes and gates. We constantly see this stuff in the news, right? Where submarines or ships are entering into our space, etc. And its fleet was actually once twice as big as the United States of America. Russia has done in the past and will continue, no matter what its politics are, to make a bid to control the sea lanes of the world. And in so doing, it can, at will, control the nation's ships and their cargoes of the world. And we're in a dangerous situation here because we have several of our large ports, like Los Angeles, that are controlled by the Chinese. Not a good situation. If Russia or Gog and all of their friends rule the waves, it's going to be an untenable thing indeed, and will be a case of woe to the world when Gog of the land of Magog happens upon this situation. And it'll be especially bad for a pact between the USA and European nations such as NATO. Those NATO nations today continually monitor the large Russian fleets as they're heading out to sea and circle the globe, with the North Sea being particularly the hotspot of the seas. Russia must sail into the North Sea from one of its few ports, that of Murmansk, which we've heard of in history throughout World War II. Very important piece of real estate, I guess. The other important waters for Gog, or Russia, are from Sebastopol and through the Dardanelles, which reminds us of memories of World War I. In the east, his ships go out into the Sea of Japan. Russia's land area is massive, but its outlets to the sea are few. Yet he has been building ships and submarines on a very large scale. The question should be asked, where are they all going and why? Those two eagle faces of the age-old Russian insignia facing east and west will be finally put into operation through prophecy, thereby hoping to dominate the world to realize its dream held for so long. Today, one face of the eagle is still fixed toward a totalitarian regime as corrupt and frightening as Hitler was. Right? Don't forget, under communism, millions of their own citizens have been murdered. And that's what our politicians are embracing. Maybe in their own ignorance, I don't know. They somehow believe that man has evolved into a different creature. Human nature doesn't change. And their aim and desire are the complete rule of mankind. And the other face of the eagle remains the imperial empire Russia, with an evil leader holding grandiose ideas to control wealth and power and other land masses. Its eagle eye seeing from far its prey and its spoil. And so the North Sea, where some of the children of the house of Israel live within the British Isles, is a near target for Russian ships, missiles, and planes. And we've already considered them, as Gog of the land of Magog in prophecy. So William Shakespeare wrote some interesting and poetic words about the land of unwalled villages that were at rest. And we can see that in Richard II, Act 1, Scene 1. It says, this royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this Eden, demi-paradise, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this fortress built by nature for herself, against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone in the silvery sea, which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house, against the envy of less happier lands. This wall that he speaks of, this silvery sea set by God, was the means for the house of Israel's safety. Look at Ezekiel 38, verse 12, where it says, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell at the center of the earth. Right? Again, it's a reference to God. This word spoil or plunder we've heard before in Daniel 11:33, when dealing with World War I, when it meant plunder with booty to be taken away through the war. Spoil or plunder is to strip with violence, to ruin and lose valuable qualities. Right? So in Daniel 11:33 it says, and the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. This word prey is property to be taken away from an enemy in war. All living creatures, whether man or beast, are to be at another's mercy in this situation. It is to get things by violence and to cause to pine and wear away. These two words, spoil and prey, are typical explanations of the violence that total war brings. These two words will come into being for all men to see, with the result of Russia planting his tabernacles firmly in the isles, which is pictured in Daniel 11:45. When Ezekiel 38 writes, or when Ezekiel writes in chapter 38, in verse 12 of Russia, he says, will turn your hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited. It means this. Early history of the British Isles, though sketchy, has been made known to us through archaeology. They say that the first wave of gales or goidels entered around 1000 BC with the Bronze Age, that the inpouring of the Britons around 600 BC with the Iron Age, and before that, a Stone Age people arrived known as the Painted Picts. Some scholars say these people also were Gaels, and that's G-A-E-L-S. Others say they were the Teutons, and still others say they were allied to the Welsh tribes. History of the Isles of early times is conjecture and rests on scholarly theories. The Isles were a land covered in the mists of millenniums gone before, during many changes of weather patterns that left their mark on that land. As far as the then civilized man in the Middle East was concerned, it perhaps never existed, because for them the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea pouring out into the Atlantic Ocean was the end of the world, which then emptied into an abyss. Though it is recorded that later Phoenicians found their way to the Isles. Desolate would then have been the right word for the British Isles during the early times of the civilized East and Europe. To be desolate means to forsake and leave alone, afflicted, a ruinous condition, or neglected. Isaiah 18:7, for the last days, gives us a good description of the lands of the house of Israel, which they were eventually to inhabit. If you look at Isaiah 18:7, it says, at that time, tribute will be brought to Yehovah Sabaoth, from a people tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a nation mighty and conquering, whose land the rivers divide, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of Yehovah Sabaoth. So this regathering of Israel, right? It says, shall present a present be brought, a tribute will be brought to Yehovah, to be made known and bring to view before a superior for consideration. Right? Unto Yehovah Sabaoth, or a person possessing supreme power and authority of a multitude of persons, of men and angels. From a people feared near and far, both nations of Israel and Gentile and Jew. They are extraordinary, are adapted to arouse fear in others because they're born position, right? They were born into this. These promises that were made, we were born into. We had nothing to do with it. Their origin and first cause was not of their own making at all. And he says, a nation mighty and conquering. The whole 12 tribes of Israel, measured out to value for good and evil. And they've been trodden upon in the earth. And he's now walking with a much more measured step. It says, whose land the rivers divide, which is to say, a land the waters have rearranged and to become corrupted from its original ways. This is to Mount Zion, the place of the name of Yehovah Sabaoth, or a land marked out in some way, yet the name of a person possessing supreme authority was upon the land, called the British Isles because the people became worshipers of God and his Christ. The Mount of Zion, or the holy seed, or called people from amongst them. Note the expression here in Isaiah where it says the rivers have divided. The Bible tells us the isles, then shrouded in mystery, was spoiled by the great flood of sea and rivers of Noah's time. The sciences tell us the cycle of ice and heat that came and went, lifted or lowered that land here and there. And so it was also the same picture with America, when the rivers of waters divided or spoiled and carved out great valleys and left mountains high and dry, which left these lands alone and neglected for a long time. The topsoil had washed into the ocean, sometimes leaving swamps or exposed pitted areas. The water scarred coastlines, pouring over some islands and drowning them for all time, because we are told in Genesis 7:18 through 24 that the hills and mountains were covered with water. So going back to Ezekiel 38:12, it says, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations. Right? To turn one's hand means that Russia will cause to move around, encircle, and direct himself toward the once desolate places that are the British Isles and America. The word inhabited means to now dwell in and occupy a place of settled residence, for to live and abide. And this is exactly what the house of Israel did when it first came out of the nations of the earth with the ebb and flow of peoples. The nations of the earth gave up some of its Israelite peoples for the isles. Israel put down roots and gathered its people out of a nation here and there. Now, secular history and Daniel's prophecies showed us that the remote isles of Britain took into itself Celtic tribes of the Gaelic, ancient Britons and Welsh, Romans with slaves, Germanic tribes of the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Franks, Vikings, or Norsemen of Danes, Norwegians and of Sweden, Normans, and many other Europeans of Spain, France, Italy, Holland, etc., who were all molded into a peculiar British nation, dwelling as one people, safe from the troubles of other nations. They became an insular people because of their geographical position. They were being protected by their isolation. The house of Israel made the isles their own motherland, occupied it, and put down roots and called themselves British, after the name of the Celtic tribe Britain. So when both Ezekiel and Isaiah said they inhabited the desolate land and gathered to themselves many people, indeed, secular history bears that out. Even some of the house of Judah lived amongst them. And it's necessary to emphasize here that these verses of prophecy of the gathering of peoples out of the nations is not alluding directly to Jewish history in the house of Judah. Their ingathering to Israel's land didn't occur until 1948. And after he drunk the dregs of his bitter cup under Hitler's regime. The quote-unquote indignation of which is given in Daniel 11:36 and Isaiah 51:17 through 23. The lament in Isaiah for the holy seed called Jerusalem, who were within the terror that the Jewish nation experienced during World War II. One can see that picture in Isaiah of the heart-rending words for all to read, written by the prophets so very long ago. These words are written toward the incoming kingdom age of our Lord and Master Jesus the Christ, because Jerusalem is asked to awake up out of that long sleep within their secular history. And just wrapping up this part of the study, we can see all things are separated, then brought together and written for our learning correctly. By no stretch of the imagination can one say that Judah had dwelt safely during his walk through history, or in a settled residence unafraid of other people. We're not reading in Ezekiel of the Jew living in Judea under the Romans or under the Maccabees, nor of their return to Palestine under Ezra and Nehemiah around 444 BC, because we are unraveling verses in Ezekiel 38 of Russia coming down and toward the lands of all the full nation of Israel's people, the 12 tribes in the earth in these last days. So, brethren, we'll stop there for now. And we'll pick this up next time. Hopefully you found that interesting. I thought it was quite interesting, this continually evolving concept of these two houses making up the 10 tribes or the 12 tribes of Israel, and how they fit into the prophecies. And it appears that the timing of some of the prophecies we thought were going to occur may indeed be off, and we were looking at the incorrect time frame. So with that, we will have our final hymn.